In the shadow of rising fire across the Middle East, as missiles streaked through the skies and the world held its breath, a question echoed from Washington to Tehran, from Tel Aviv to global capitals. Why didn't America fully pull the trigger on Iran? Why did the most powerful military force on Earth hesitate at the edge of total war? And the answer lies not in weakness, but in a complex web of strategy, fear, economics, and the brutal lessons of history. Because while the United States and Israel did launch large-scale strikes under what analysts call a coordinated campaign to cripple Iran's military infrastructure, targeting hundreds of sites and key leadership figures, even eliminating top commanders and dealing heavy blows to Iran's capabilities, the reality quickly became clear. This was not Iraq, not Afghanistan, and certainly not a war that could be ended with a single decisive strike. Because Iran is not just a country, it is a system, a network, a deeply entrenched regional power with asymmetric warfare capabilities, underground facilities, proxy militias spread across the Middle East, and perhaps most dangerously, the ability to ignite a conflict far beyond its borders. And as American planners studied the battlefield, they realized something critical. Pulling the trigger fully, meaning a ground invasion or regime change, would not start a war, it would start a chain reaction. Because Iran has the capacity to strike U.S. bases across the region, disrupt global oil supply through the Strait of Hormuz, and trigger retaliatory attacks through allied groups, turning a regional conflict into a global economic crisis almost overnight. And this is not speculation, as even ongoing operations have already shown how quickly oil markets react, how global inflation spikes, and how fragile the international system becomes when energy routes are threatened. And inside the United States, another battlefield was forming, not in deserts or skies, but in public opinion, where a growing majority of Americans began questioning the purpose of the war, with polls showing widespread disapproval and demand for a quick end rather than escalation. Because the ghosts of Iraq and Afghanistan still linger, wars that began with confidence but ended in exhaustion, costing trillions of dollars, thousands of lives, and leaving behind instability rather than victory. And policymakers knew that a full-scale war with Iran could be even more dangerous, more expensive, and far more unpredictable. Because unlike previous conflicts, Iran has a larger population, a vast territory, and decades of preparation specifically designed to resist invasion, including hardened underground nuclear facilities and missile systems that cannot be easily destroyed from the air, meaning that even overwhelming air superiority would not guarantee success. And so the strategy shifted, not to win quickly, but to weaken gradually, to degrade capabilities without triggering total collapse, because total collapse could itself be catastrophic, potentially leading to civil war, refugee crises, and the rise of even more extreme factions. And at the same time, the geopolitical chessboard extended far beyond Iran, because any full-scale U.S. assault risked drawing in other global powers, including China and Russia, not necessarily through direct military confrontation, but through economic and strategic countermeasures that could reshape the global order, especially at a time when de-dollarization efforts are already gaining momentum and the dominance of the US dollar is being quietly challenged on the world stage. And so every decision in Washington became a calculation not just of military success, but of global consequences, asking not can we win, but what happens after we win, because history has shown that winning the war is often the easiest part. Winning the peace is where empires fall. And this is where the phrase "couldn't pull the trigger" becomes misleading, because America did act, it did strike, it did engage, but it stopped short of the point of no return, choosing controlled aggression over total war,
pressure over invasion, strategy over impulse, because the true danger was never just Iran's missiles or nuclear ambitions, but the uncontrollable escalation that could follow a full-scale attack. And in that moment, restraint became the most powerful weapon, not because America lacked the strength to destroy Iran, but because it understood the cost of doing so, a cost measured not just in bombs and battles, but in global instability, economic shockwaves, political backlash, and the risk of igniting a conflict that no one, not even a superpower, could fully control. And so the world watched as America stood at the edge, finger on the trigger, and chose not to pull it all the way, not out of fear, but out of calculation. Because sometimes the most dangerous move in war is the one you don't make.
And yet, as the dust from initial strikes settled and the headlines began to fade into analysis rather than shock, a deeper, more unsettling realization started to emerge inside the corridors of power in Washington. That this conflict was never going to be defined by a single moment of dominance, but by a prolonged test of endurance, patience, and psychological warfare. Because Iran, unlike conventional adversaries, does not rely solely on direct confrontation. It thrives in the gray zones of conflict, where deniability, proxy warfare, and strategic ambiguity become its most lethal weapons. And almost immediately after absorbing the initial blows, the response began. Not in the form of massive counterstrikes that would invite overwhelming retaliation, but through calculated, dispersed actions across the region, small in isolation, but devastating in accumulation. Attacks on shipping routes, cyber disruptions, pressure through allied militias, and sudden escalations in unexpected places, forcing the United States into a position where it had to defend everywhere at once, while Iran only needed to exploit a few critical vulnerabilities. And this is where the balance of power began to shift from brute force to strategic resilience, because maintaining dominance in such an environment requires not just military superiority, but economic stamina, political unity, and global support, all of which were beginning to show signs of strain. As allies grew cautious, markets reacted nervously, and questions intensified about the long-term objective of the conflict. Because without a clear endgame, even the most precise military operations risk becoming part of an endless cycle of escalation and retaliation. And within the Pentagon, planners were confronted with a harsh truth. Every additional step forward increased the probability of unintended consequences. Because Iran's regional network was not a single entity that could be dismantled overnight, but a web of influence stretching across multiple countries, deeply embedded in local dynamics, meaning that any attempt to eliminate it entirely would require not just military intervention, but a complete restructuring of the region's political landscape, a task that history has repeatedly proven to be nearly impossible without triggering chaos. And at the same time, intelligence assessments continued to warn about the nuclear dimension of the conflict, not necessarily in terms of immediate deployment, but in the strategic leverage it provided. Because the closer Iran appeared to advancing its nuclear capabilities, the more dangerous any direct confrontation became, turning every military decision into a high-stakes gamble with consequences that could extend far beyond the battlefield. And this uncertainty created a paradox for American leadership. Acting too aggressively could accelerate the very threat they were trying to prevent, while acting too cautiously could allow that threat to grow unchecked. And navigating between these two extremes required a level of precision and restraint that few conflicts in modern history have demanded. And meanwhile, on the global stage, rival powers observed closely, not just as spectators, but as strategic participants in a broader geopolitical contest, because every move made by the United States in this conflict sent signals about its priorities, its limits, and its willingness to engage in prolonged confrontation. And those signals were being interpreted, analyzed, and in some cases,
quietly countered through economic alliances, diplomatic maneuvers, and shifts in global trade patterns, gradually reshaping the balance of power in ways that extended far beyond the Middle East. And back at home, the American public continued to grapple with a familiar dilemma: the tension between national security and the cost of war, between the desire to project strength and the fear of becoming entangled in another endless conflict. And this internal pressure began to influence external strategy, reinforcing the idea that while decisive action might satisfy short-term expectations, sustainable strategy required long-term thinking. And so the approach evolved further, focusing not on dramatic escalation, but on controlled pressure, intelligence-driven operations, and strategic containment, a slow and deliberate effort to limit Iran's capabilities without triggering a full-scale war. Because by this point, it had become clear that the real battlefield was not just physical territory, but time itself, a race between escalation and restraint, between reaction and calculation. And in this race, every decision carried weight, every move had consequences, and every moment brought the world closer to a tipping point that no one could fully predict. And so, once again, America found itself standing at a crossroads, not of power, but of choice, where pulling the trigger completely might bring immediate impact, but also irreversible consequences, and holding back might preserve stability, but at the risk of prolonged uncertainty. And in that fragile space between action and restraint, the true nature of modern warfare revealed itself, not as a clash of armies alone, but as a complex, multi-dimensional struggle, where the greatest victories are often the ones that never make headlines, and the most dangerous decisions are the ones that seem, at first glance, like the easiest to make.